Filibustering during the age of U.S. expansionism. This effort is a short study in which we examine a unique phenomenon in Texas history termed filibustering. Filibustering grew out of the chaotic political conditions which occurred in both Mexico and the United States. This period of time, beginning from 1848 to about 1860, would see private armed organized groups whose primary motivations were to invade a country like Mexico with hopes to gain a permanent foothold or annex more territory to the United States. Presently, while the violators of the international border are coming from the south side of Mexico, historically, the opposite was understood to be true in 1848 to 1860. During the 19th century, the Mexican government would refer to such individuals that attempted to invade Mexico in armed groups as filibusters. The word is derived from the Dutch word freebooter, which meant one who was a pirate or a robber. The Spanish would come to refer to these same groups of people as filibusteros. A noteworthy Texas filibustero of that time, and the subject of this video, Jose Maria J. Carvajal, would emerge as a character closely associated with this activity throughout in the northern provinces of Mexico. He was seen as a determined norteño revolutionary who, along with his Anglo-Texan backers, kept the area of the Rio Grande in a constant state of violence during this time. When war broke out with the United States late in the spring of 1846, Carvajal was living in Mexico and soon became friends with General Antonio Canales. Canales and Carvajal joined in a rebellion against the centralist autocracy of Mexico City. Carvajal was just then placed in charge of a 425-man cavalry, but was reluctant to fight the Americans on the battlefield throughout Mexico. The commander of the northern Mexican forces, General Francisco Mejia, suspected him of secret collaboration with the enemy and only grudgingly supplied him with material. Carvajal's engagement of American forces was seen as so sporadic and half-hearted that many of his men suspected his motives. Some even believed El Jefe was fighting with the Mexicans merely to keep the United States out of northern Mexico so that he could establish a little republic independent of Mexico City. Unbeknownst to them, Carvajal's purpose was exactly that, to create the Republic of the Rio Grande. The politics in Mexico between 1848 through 1860. Let's begin by immersing ourselves back to the time between 1848 through 1860 in Mexican history. On May 1848 in Querétaro, Mexico, representatives of the Mexican and U.S. governments would congregate to finalize the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was negotiated in part by Nicholas P. Trist. Mexicans assumed that the United States would live up to its treaty obligations and would enforce its neutrality laws in respect to continuing armed intervention. Unfortunately, Mexicans did not comprehend the peculiar nature of the U.S. neutrality laws. It was confusing to say the least because the laws permitted anyone to stockpile arms and ammunition as long as they did not use the U.S. as a base from which to launch an expedition into a country that was at peace with the United States. Additionally, Mexicans were also expecting that strict enforcement of the U.S. neutrality laws of 1818, which prescribed then a potential fine of $3,000 and prison terms of 3 years for violators, would allow Mexico to develop both economically and politically without interference. However, Mexicans were unaware that there were too few federal agents in the field who actually understood the law. Things would get more complicated because state and federal bureaucracies had overlapping responsibilities, which also affected the manner in how the Army was policing along the border. Essentially, as a result of the confusion, many filibustering groups would go unmonitored in the United States. To contextualize, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would award to the United States approximately one-half of Mexico's territory, which then consisted of California, Arizona, and New Mexico. One of the agreements reached was delineated in Article 11, in which the U.S. would protect the Mexican frontier from any types of attacks that originated north of the border. Furthermore, Article 11 was very important to the Mexicans because they had grown tired of the constant Indian raids in that part of the country, and now the U.S. would be stepping in to curtail that activity. Eventually, we will see filibustering would fall under this clause later on. Although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would bring its own set of problems, Mexican internal politics were also unstable well into the regime of General Porfirio Diaz towards the end of the 19th century, conditions which placed Mexico vulnerable to outside interference, particularly along the northern border. Thus, Mexican politics were characterized since its independence as a struggle for power between the centralists and the federalists. The centralists would represent the interests of those who wanted to keep the government power in the hands of the central government, which included religious, land-owning, and military elite institutions, while the Federalists were composed of those supporters who espoused state autonomy in political and economic affairs. Things appeared to worsen even more. In 1853, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna ceded additional Mexican land to the United States for $10 million. According to the Misilla Treaty, which was also known as the Gadsden Purchase Agreement, he agreed to the abrogation of Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This action would infuriate the liberals, and in 1854, via the Plan de Ayala, they called for Santa Anna's ouster. As soon as they were able to, by November of 1855, the liberal forces had deposed Santa Anna and established Juan Alvarez as the provisional president. Benito Juarez would briefly serve as the Minister of Justice and Religion under him. Instead of reforming Mexican society, Juarez fomented discord by alienating the church and military, thereby reducing their influence. Eventually, conservatives forced the removal of Alvarez, and he resigns in December of 1855. In his place, Ignacio Comonfort, a conservative, assumes the presidency, who then alienates Juarez and other liberals by not redistributing lands to the peasants. Things start to boil at this point. The end result is that these liberal-conservative conflicts would directly contribute to the poor state of readiness of the Mexican army and militias. It also undermines the military institutions who then failed to protect the country from the U.S. during the War of 1846 to 1848. The Mexican army receives poor training, had poor weapons. There was also a lack of individual decisiveness, weak leadership, and sectional rivalries. Furthermore, the permanent army and militia formations became under strength, and soldiers were seen as poorly motivated. In an effort to turn things around, in 1857, Mexican statesmen wrote a new constitution that favored federal and congressional powers. Nevertheless, the constitution was poorly received, and Comonfort shortly resigns and flees to Mexico City. His last act in office is to release liberal leader Benito Juarez from prison. By December 1st, 1857, Juarez assumes the presidency and was determined to see this new constitution through. However, conservatives soon rebelled against him. Things got progressively worse, and on January the 11th, 1858, General Felix Zuloaga proclaims himself president, which then sets off the 3-year War of the Reform. Juarez occupies Veracruz, and Zuloaga occupies Mexico City. Consequently, the United States recognizes the Juarez government on April 8, 1859, and helps him in his bid to be the legitimate president of Mexico. However, Juarez remains as president until the French intervention, which forces him to flee to the United States. Amidst this chaos, the frontier remained sparsely populated. No doubt national struggles between conservatives and the liberals in the frontier states caused instabilities in areas that would border the United States. Such conditions would lead to the constant Indian raids and inspired numerous efforts by Americans to attempt organized paramilitary or filibustering ventures, and by 1848, 1850, and 1852 and later, Mexico tried to resolve the problem of too few people on the frontier by attempting to colonize the area, which fails from the beginning as a result of internal instability. Nevertheless, a considerable number of Mexicans recognized that ongoing political instability and economic weakness affected the country, but it felt strongly compelled to develop the frontier to protect the area from the United States. Unfortunately, this was the kind of instability that Carvajal exploits to achieve his filibustering plans. And this concludes the first part of a two-part series on the American filibuster Jose Maria J. Carvajal. Join us for part 2 a little later on this month.